Hey everybody, it's Chainsaw Reacts. Today I'm here to review a film that I thought would never actually happen, but it did because it happened in the comics. Of course, I'm talking about Justice League, RWBY, Superheroes, and Huntsman Part 1. That's a mouthful, it's a long title, wish they would shorten that, but regardless, I'm here to review this today. I do want to thank Warner Brothers Home Entertainment for sending me an early copy to review for the channel. I know this film was leaked online. I wanted to make sure that you guys knew I watched it legit. Before we jump in, I really enjoy the cover of the film. I really like it a lot. This is a really cool shot. I remember seeing the announcement that this film was officially happening. I believe it was at Comic-Con last year, 2022, and I was like, okay, it happened in the comics. It makes sense this was happening. If this was the first time these characters were crossing over in this animated film versus it happening first in the comics, this would have been more jarring, I think, but I was actually quite surprised by this story for sure. After seeing the synopsis beforehand, watching the film, they don't give you too much information with the synopsis, but they give you enough to understand that there is some weird stuff going on here. And I think they did a pretty good job overall handling all these changes and what's happening with the Justice League characters and why the Justice League are here in Remnant. Full disclosure, I am not caught up on RWBY, but I am caught up for the most part. I'm somewhere a little bit into Volume 8 of RWBY. I know they're actually completing, I think it's already completed Volume 9. So I'm not completely caught up, but I've seen the majority of the show throughout the years. And I think they did a pretty good job of highlighting Remnant in terms of like, okay, we're going to be basically introducing the Grimm right away in the opening scene. And all the RWBY characters that you're going to be seeing in this film, sparse throughout the first little bit of the film, and the Justice League characters, and they do a good job of like basically establishing to anybody who hasn't seen RWBY what Remnant is, what the Grimm are, who are these characters, and that's something I really appreciated because I was wondering, are they actually going to make this film to where if you have not seen RWBY, you're going to be completely lost? But they actually do a good job of introducing all the RWBY characters and introducing Remnant, the Grimm threat, and then the changes that the synopsis kind of hinted, the changes of the world that has kind of occurred because of the Justice League members being within it now. It changes things, and then you quickly realize, okay, something is up here. And they do a good job of hiding that in the marketing and in the synopsis, but I think people will be pleasantly surprised. But I was actually surprised that they actually make it to where if you haven't seen RWBY, you can actually enjoy this film without knowing the show per se. Besides my biggest question of if people are going to understand what's happening with this film if they have never seen RWBY, my other biggest question I had on top of that was, how are the character dynamics going to be? How are the character interactions going to be? Because they could easily make it to where this film has the Justice League, Team RWBY, and all the characters on RWBY who are appearing in the film just team up and then just fight throughout the whole film, which does occur, but there's actually some story purpose behind certain interactions and certain fight sequences. And I feel like the character interactions between both sides, RWBY and Justice League, are really well done. There are certain ones that I'm like, they spend a lot of time on them and these character interactions, and others not so much. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. There's a couple of character interactions between both sides I want to talk about briefly that I feel like were good, like actual positive ones that were actually benefiting the story and actually pretty interesting. One of them is Wonder Woman, Yang, and Blake. There's some great moments between these characters where they have a moment to speak to each other, get to understand each other, and it's this kind of relationship between these three characters that I think were really interesting, and I wish they could have explored more, but then again, that's just making the film longer just for this one particular thing. I feel like they did a pretty good job with that. Another one is Bruce Wayne, Batman, and Weiss. Having those two characters interact, I thought was an odd pairing at first, but then as it kept growing in terms of their actual scenes together, it started to make more sense. It was definitely interesting for sure, because this is not exactly the Bruce Wayne Batman we're kind of used to, because he's a teen in this story because of the changes that occurred with the Justice League being transported essentially in a way to Remnant, and there's a lot of things about that, but it was interesting to kind of see that dynamic there. On the other side, there are character interactions that I felt it was just kind of there, because there are certain characters like say Cyborg and Flash who don't really have a lot going on in this film. Like, they're kind of there, but they don't really interact too much with a lot of the other characters. Like, there's some small interactions here and there, but they're just kind of like there. You know what I'm saying? Also Vixen as well, who I think could have been interesting to see Vixen maybe interact with some more characters, or like I said, Flash and Cyborg. but they really don't. So there's like the double-edged sword to where we have some great character interactions with like Yang, Blake, and Wonder Woman, but over here you have certain characters that are just in the story just to be a part of the ensemble of, say, the Justice League. And I feel like all the RWBY characters actually have more to do than, say, the Justice League members as a whole. As I mentioned, all the RWBY characters in this film that are introduced have a pretty interesting role to play within the film, whether it's a small role but it's important, or a big role and they have a lot of things going on. The DC Trinity, in terms of the Justice League, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, they all have a important narrative to play, an important part to play in this story. Whereas Cyborg and, say, Flash and Vixen, they're kind of there. Like, they do some interesting things, but I really wish they had more to do. But I think it really falls down to a negative, which there's a lot of characters they're handling in this movie. And I kind of wish they would have pulled back on some RWBY and Justice League as well, to where, it's not saying just the Trinity of DC and the RWBY characters and Team RWBY, but maybe to where it's Team RWBY, you know, the four of them, the Trinity, and maybe Flash, and then maybe another character from RWBY or two, and then maybe we also include Jessica Cruz, Green Lantern, which I felt like I wish she would have had more of a importance, even though her role is actually really important later on in terms of the significance of her. But I wish they would have established her more within the narrative to build up to where, okay, this is the big moment for her character. I wish they would have done more to build her up. But the thing is that they were introducing her along with other DC characters and other RWBY characters in the mix as well. And it's like, there's a lot of characters here. I wish they would have pulled back just a bit. Let's talk about the looks of the DC characters. Of course, they're transported to Remnant, so their outfits and their looks, obviously besides the fact that they're teenagers, a big change, but their actual outfits and everything line up and match kind of the world of Remnant. So there's a lot of questions about this and a lot of debate and people criticizing online because the looks of Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and all of them have drastically changed. Cyborg, he kind of looks still like Cyborg, but they're, you know, for the most part, they all have shifted their outfits to more match up Remnant and everything in the style of, you know, this world that they're now they're transported to. And I will have to say that if you go look and actually see some of the crossover in the comics, some of their looks I think are pulled directly from the comics from what I was kind of understanding, because I actually have not read the crossover comics that have occurred, but some of them you can actually look up, you can easily see where it's pretty close to the comics, at least in some of the crossover, because there's actually more crossover stuff than I realized. Like, other stuff was popping up, I'm like, oh, there's other stuff, like they look a little different there and there, and like, okay. But I say for the most part, they still have that essence of what they are in DC, and you see some stuff that I won't get into that I think is pretty interesting about the Justice League side of things. But in terms of their outfits, yes, some of them could have been changed more to be more in line with what they look like in their world. But at the same time, this is Remnant. This is a whole story thing that's happening here. So I get it's where they had to change them, and like I said, I think most of them kind of match up with the comics, at least the first time they've ever crossed over. But there's some changes, but I don't hate them. The ending, which I won't get into because it's a spoiler, has me questioning a couple of things, and especially with the title Part 1, I'm like, okay, so there's more going on, because they clearly do. You don't put Part 1 into a story unless there's something else that's going to occur. And look, the story isn't done in terms of what's been set up here, but I was actually quite surprised with how it actually ended. Seeing with that Part 1 in the title, I'm like, oh, they're ending it. Okay, they're ending it there. Last thing I want to cover on, because I really don't want to get into spoilers, because if I just keep talking, eventually I will get into spoilers, and I'm not going to do that. The last thing I do want to cover briefly is the action in this film, which I do reference earlier, is that there's a lot of action in this film. There's a lot of action going on, but there's some story purpose behind most of it. But there's a lot of great action moments. A lot of great action with the RWBY characters versus the Grimm, and then the Justice League characters versus the Grimm, and then with the team up of all of them together was really, really cool, and seeing how they're handling the Grimm and these altered Grimm that you see throughout the film. And I will have to say, it was really well done in terms of giving them all time to shine and seeing the team up and the dynamic between the characters and how they can use their different abilities to take out these Grimm, and seeing the variety of Grimm, because there's a huge variety of Grimm they highlight throughout this, because they could have easily, okay, let's just pick 2 or 3 versions of Grimm and call it a day. They actually go out of their way to make sure that we're seeing a huge variety of Grimm in this for our heroes to face off against. And it was like, there's a lot of Grimm, and there's a lot of stuff going on here, but the action was pretty good. I feel like overall this film is successful in what it was trying to accomplish with a story that has both the Justice League characters and the RWBY characters working together, whether it's individuals like Weiss and Bruce Wayne over here, or having Wonder Woman interacting with Blake right away when the film opens, and then all of them eventually coming together to take on the threat of the film. I feel like as well, in terms of it being successful, it also kind of falls short because I feel like the runtime could have been easily been a couple minutes longer to help establish this film, because this film opens up right away, just right into the crossover, and I feel like it would have been maybe benefited more to maybe build up to that point. But once you see the ending, it made more sense why it started the way it did. But still, that's just me. That's just me having a little nitpick. But I feel like this film, I think people will enjoy it if you've seen RWBY or not. If you just want to see the crossover, this type thing. Now, there are moments where I'm like, that's a questionable decision. That's a questionable line there from that character to say. But I feel like for the most part, they handle all the characters well, even though some of them get the short end of the stick to where they're kind of there, not really doing too much. They have some cool action moments and a couple of lines, but they're not really doing too much for the narrative per se. They're just kind of in the mix, like Vixen. Cyborg has a little more to do, but they could have easily gave Cyborg a lot more to do in this movie, but they don't. They have an explanation to why, and it's just like, okay, whatever, because they could have easily just not had that in at all. Can't even talk this morning. But anyways, so this film is successful in its narrative, its story, its action, the character interactions, even though they could have pulled back on a couple of not being here, because I feel like if it was less characters from the two teams crossing over, we would have had more time with the individuals, and then the dynamic itself, the team dynamic, because a lot of it's like, okay, characters are being separated and they're coming back together. It's like it was a lot happening, so it wasn't like you couldn't follow the narrative, but still, you know what I'm saying? So yes, I feel like this film was worth watching, and I'm curious to see what part 2 is going to be, even though there has been an official confirmation of part 2, but I'm assuming that'll happen pretty soon, because you can't wait too long to put out part 2 when this is already out, and there's a lot of things. There's some things left up in the air in regards to what does this all mean, and what's going on. I have some questions. But without getting any spoilers, I'm not going to do that. So overall, I had a good time watching this, especially with somebody who is, as I've seen the majority of RWBY, I'm not fully caught up, but seeing the majority of it, and then of course loving the Justice League characters, I enjoyed the crossover, and I'm more curious to read the crossover comics, to see how that plays out. So anyways, that's my review. Sorry that I didn't go into too much detail, but I mean, I can't really go into spoilers because that's not really fair. But I had a good time with the film overall. So hope you guys enjoyed the review. I'll talk to you guys soon. Peace out.